The session on the new geopolitics, it's interesting in a sense because when we listen to what we have heard so far, yesterday and today, the market has not really parceled in the geopolitical concerns that people have about Middle East, about Venezuela, other parts of the world. And while in previous years, there was at times there was a geopolitics premium, there hasn't been such a premium for a while. So people assume that either we have no idea, or they think things are fine and it's all under control, and there are not going to be any disruptions. If there are disruptions, well, tight oil will take care of it. I think in reality, the situation, as you will hear from the C speakers, is quite different and is not as happy as some of the people in the trading procession may think it is, and it could have significant impacts on a future pricing on availability of oil. Now, we have an excellent panel here. On my left is Alastair Crooke, director and founder of Conflict Forum. Next to him is Dmitri Trenin, director, Carnegie Moscow Center. And next to him is Ambassador Charles Freeman, chairman, Project International and senior fellow at the Watson Institute, Brown University. Further details you can find in your handout, but we rather start with the session. What I plan to do is start out with the three of you asking you a more general question, your comments you have on that, and then I will go into more individual questions. Well, the first one starts as this. You know, it has become apparent that post-World War II global order, Pax Americana, has come under severe stress due to rising economic and geostrategic position of China, the re-emergence of an assertive Russia, as well as regional powers such as Turkey and Iran, but perhaps even more due to the reluctance currently of the current US administration to maintain a leading global strategic role in favor of an America First position. What is this policy leading to? Will we witness a major reversal or change in the post-war strategic balance, and what are its implications for trade, finance, economy, and strategic alliances? That's a handful, Alastair, but I'll ask you to start out.
That's all.
That's all to start out.
Just cover all that.
There, exactly. Right.
Okay. Well, when Herman asked me originally, he said, what I want to ask essentially is this different from what happened to the British at the end of the last war, when the British were exhausted of the last war, they were hugely indebted and left, if you like, their imperial role behind, or are we seeing something quite different? In other words, is America just reaching a point of exhaustion and no longer has the energy or the will to lead the world? I think that it's actually more complex and that it's not the same position as happened to the UK at the end of the World War. I think that what we have seen has been a steady rise of what I would call the urban cosmopolitan global elites in the last 20 years and their culture. And I think that what we have seen from this is that this is a culture for a struggle for the world, America as world order that is being pursued. But this culture, which is, I think, characterized particularly in the urban sphere by what is called identity politics. By that I mean every young person, boy or girl now, is invited to choose their sexuality, their gender. There are 60 different sexualities for them to choose from now, and they're told to choose that. Whether they're a gender activist, their identity is a gender activist, even their identity ethnically is no longer connected with their DNA, but is optional. So you can have a DNA that is strictly American DNA, and then opt to be Moroccan, whatever. Well, this cultural process that we have seen from the urban elites is like an explosive device. It is an explosive device which is really intended to demolish the sense of culture, the alternative culture, the culture, if you like, of America, or of the sense of America as understood as a matrix of history, of literature, of intellectual, of religion, that has produced whatever it is that is understood to be America. I think the Russians would call it soul as much as anything else, but the essence of what it is. And they have seen that this fragmentation, if you like, of identities explodes the ability, it explodes all the containers of really being able to have that sort of cultural, if you like. And so what we're seeing, I think, is a sense of actually trying to recover the sovereignty of culture again. And this is not confined to America, incidentally. I think there is a deep understanding now that sovereignty, and this applies to Europe as it applies everywhere else, sovereignty is not about remote processes of power. It's about whether you think and act sovereignly. If you think and act sovereignly, then you are more sovereign. So how do you get, if you like, your sovereignty back as a people? It's by establishing and, if you like, recuperating and recovering the sense of what it is to be American, what it is to be Russian, what it is to be, if you like, French. Now, it's playing out in very different ways. I think in Europe, you can see it playing out in a slightly different way. The urban elites, i.e. Brussels, the urban elites are having trouble with Poland, with Hungary, and now with Spain, at least one part of Spain, because they are talking now about sovereignty and saying, no, we have our sovereignty and we are not going to have immigrants in our countries. And Europe says, of course, but we're a liberal society and you have to accept these people and you have to accept refugees. Countries are saying we have self-determination and we won't. And this is what I mean by sovereignty, when people are saying, no, if I think sovereignty, if I act sovereignty, I have sovereignty. I don't care about remote political processes elsewhere. And so what do you have in Andalusia at the moment is the Europeans trying to suppress this, push it back down, if you like, into the psychic depths, not allowing it to happen, to pressure Hungary, to Poland, to stop all this. The same in Italy, where I live, is to try and push all of these forces, if you like, that are ranging against this idea, this urban elite concept, in order to push them away. In America, I think it's actually now the reverse, in the sense. When I was last in New York, a New Yorker said to me, oh, listen, Alastair, we never were one country. We never were one state. We're actually 5 different countries. And as I'm a New Yorker, I don't want to have any association with these deplorables in the flyover states or anyone else. I'm quite happy in New York if it's quite separate. So in America, it seems to be the urban elites want to secede from the rest of America. California and New York would like to go in their own way as a separate state. And in Europe, is trying to hold the line. I think, of course, it's been very muddied because at times this has been used, particularly for geopolitical interests, where it suits, in Serbia, with Kosovo, with the Kurds, to try and blow up and destroy, if you like, the status of a number of states. But these things are taking place and are going to lead to, I think, a further tensions within Europe, within America. The same processes have been present in Russia, and they will also be present in the economic structure. But I'll leave the economic side for them.
Basically the same question, Dmitri, but how do you read it from, say, from a Russian perspective? How does the Putin and the Russian government look at this same question of how do they see the relative decline, or do they believe there is a relative decline of Pax Americana, and how do they see their emerging role in this?
Well, I think that there are two elements to the Pax Americana concept. I think that if you look at Americana, it's likely to be the prevalent force for a fairly long time. Although it's on the decline, but that decline is likely to take quite a while. But the Pax, i.e. peace, among the major powers is over. You asked me, Herman, how I think the Russian government feels about it. I think that the Russian government feels it's at war. It's not a shooting war, but neither was the previous war, the Cold War, a shooting match. But it was real. The current war, call it, just to use a popular expression, the hybrid war, is also a reality, although people are not getting physically killed. I think that the Russian government feels that the principal cause of its conflict with the United States is a fundamental difference about the views about the global order. Russia looks at the world order from a very different perspective than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, wanted to impose a certain model of a global order on the rest of the world. The Russian Federation, taking the cue from what Alastair has been saying, is much more nationalistic. It cares far less about the rest of the world. It mostly cares about Russia. But it wants to set the interest, it wants to set the, let me put it this way, it wants to be able to defend its interests the way it sees it. It does not want to accept its interests as they are formulated by someone sitting in Washington, or someone sitting in Brussels, or someone sitting I don't know where. And that is a serious conflict. I think that the Russian government also realizes that this is pretty serious. This will not go away. Boys will not be home for Christmas. It's been going for 3.5 years. It may go on for another decade, 2 decades, we don't know. That the stakes are exceedingly high. I think that they look at the most recent economic sanctions passed by the US Congress and signed into law by President Trump as something of an economic declaration of war, which basically takes an aim at the Russian establishment, at the Russian elites. And if the United States is victorious with all that, then out goes the Russian elite, and down goes the Russian state in all likelihood. So it's pretty serious stuff. I think that when we look back on the post-Cold War period, that was a rare moment, a unique moment, I should say, in human history, when all major powers were in largely cooperative relations among themselves. And with regard to Russia, I think the price for continuing that should have been including it into some kind of a security arrangement with the United States and its allies, on conditions that would be acceptable to both sides, not on the conditions laid down by NATO, but on conditions being negotiated by both sides. For a number of reasons, that was deemed impossible. And when that became clear around late 2011, I think we embarked on a collision course. And it was only a matter of time It was only a matter of geography. Could have been, it was Ukraine, could have been something else, that there would be this collision. So I think that this is clearly, this, unlike the Cold War, this is not the organizing principle of international affairs. It's not the central thing. Russia is not what the Soviet Union was in all respects. So that's not going to be as fundamental. It is fundamental, but as dominating a factor as the Cold War was. But it can be a fairly serious factor. I think, and this is where I would conclude at this point, we're talking about a new version of the Cold War. Again, I use this expression with a huge grain of salt, because if you accept that analogy, then you'll be looking for things that will not happen because the world has changed. And you'll be missing the things that will happen because the world has changed. But it's as serious as the Cold War was, and it could be as deadly as the Cold War was. With President Trump, there may be a slightly less of a chance of a direct collision between the United States and Russia. But one big concern that the Russians had with President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, had she been elected, was that if she had been elected president, then there was a high chance that the United States, at least some of a chance, that the United States and Russian armed forces could be on a collision course, could be in a kinetic collision in places like Syria. Certainly Hillary Clinton's idea of a no-fly zone in Syria, to me, sounded like an invitation to a shooting match. And I don't think that the Russians would have shied away from that. Thank you.
Josh, you were both in China. Actually, I think you opened the office in China at the time of the rapprochement between the United States and China, but you're also in Saudi Arabia. But I want to first talk about China. China also seems to be challenging the existing order. We see what's happening in the South China Sea, in the North China Sea. It's a clear indication that an international court ruled against China on related to the law of the sea, the impact on their delineation of the South China Sea. Financially, because the Western countries didn't give them the kind of share in the World Bank that they actually should have had a right to in terms of the size of their economy, they opened their own big new regional bank, which is getting bigger and bigger. How do you see that the Chinese see this challenge? Are they, will they continue to challenge the established order primarily in the economic front, or also more in the strategic area?
Well, I think Dmitri referred correctly to differing views of global order. We do have differences about that. The United States created most of what has been the established order, and it has devoted itself, since the end of the Cold War, to defending that order as it crumbled. Obama retrenched. He saw the need and the desirability of doing so. President Trump is retreating. The retreat leaves vacuums. Those vacuums are being filled by others at the regional level, great powers moving into them, some actively. Perhaps Russia in the Middle East is a case in point. Others reluctantly, but imaginatively, which I think is the case with China. You can take the Eurasian landmass and divide it into 5 geopolitical subzones. 2 promontories, Europe, India, Russia, a great swath, 1/6 of the globe across the north, the Middle East, and East Asia. Each is evolving its own order based on relations between great powers in the region, with some participation outside, but very much driven by regional dynamics. I think it's very difficult for any of us to understand exactly what or why is happening in my country in relation to the abandonment of all sorts of established advantages. But I think you can understand it this way. There is a strong, maybe 1/3 of the population, which is ultra-nationalist and isolationist. They know nothing of the world except what they see on television, and that is a delusion, not a reality. And there is also an elite which agreed with Mr. Trump during the campaign that there needed to be a reset, a rebalancing of relationships and responsibilities internationally, with others taking greater responsibility for their own defense and affairs, and the United States lessening its burden. There's a resonance between these, although they mean very, very different things. And the odd thing is that in some respects, the effort to reset and rebalance is working. Europe, for the first time in decades, is thinking about how it can defend itself. Japan is doing the same. Japan is doing it far more effectively than Europe, by the way. The Japanese are adding independent capabilities to their military in the name of strengthening their alliance with the United States, but with the objective of transcending the alliance and achieving their own ability to act outside its framework. I think one of the things that has to be noted in this context is that the United States is not only retreating from responsibility and active involvement in the institutions of governance globally that we helped to create, but we've also abandoned key projects which are very long-standing. No more effort to produce a peace between Israel and its neighbors or the Palestinians. Talk, no action. No effort to promote democracy. That crusade, if it can be called that, is a thing of the past. Wobbling on the issue of regime change, some days against it, some days for it. Great incoherence altogether. So I think there is a difference, to go back to what Alastair said at the beginning, a very big difference between what happened to Britain in the course of the century, the first half of the 20th century, a great war that devastated Britain, followed by another war that showed that it lacked the capacity to survive on its own, and a post-war era that was in which the divestment of colonial enterprises and so on was essentially forced on Britain. The United States has not lost the capacity. It has lost the will. And we are retreating by a sort of a muddled choice, not because we must. And this is a very dangerous situation. I assume we'll talk later about issues like the Korean confrontation, the Iranian confrontation, but the adjustments are proving painful and the risks are going up. I don't think the markets have priced in either these risks or the risk that Mr. Trump's talk about inflating the American economy is all blather with no substance.
Now, the question now is, we know the reality as it has developed now since January of 2017, the relationship of the current US administration with its European allies are less than optimum. The same can be said for its allies in the Far East. But at the same time, we see Mrs. Merkel coming out of the election less strong than we had expected. Therefore, Mr. Macron's policy of trying to get the Germans to pay for a bigger share of the economic activity in Europe may not work. In your country, Italy, there are going to be elections, we don't know the outcome. How will Europe cope with this new situation? Will it follow the advice of Mr. Trump and start spending a lot more on defense, given the state of the current economy? Or will they begin to accommodate themselves, perhaps to Russia and in some extent and to others?
I think that what I described, that the Europeans can have no schadenfreude in terms of what's happening in America, because the same tensions, albeit in a different context, are present in Europe. And of course, everyone for a moment thought that parachuting Macron as a sort of ideal globalist candidate into Paris for the last elections, and the outcome of those elections, that you could hear everyone fall back with, oh, so that's over, the populists. But we see that all of these attempts to push it down deep into the sort of depths, it keeps coming up. And it's come up in the Austrian elections, it's coming up in what's happening in Spain, it's coming up with what's happening in Poland, it's coming up with the immigration question, and this is going to preoccupy Europe a great deal. I think the reaction was very clear. Everyone sees also the dissolution of the economic global sphere too, as a result of this. The political dissolution has led to the end of what I call the Plaza Accord, the original accord that people would follow the lead of the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve on interest rates and monetary policy, and so they're going to see a lot more turmoil. The natural reaction of this is people are going to hedge, going to try. They see that we're in currency wars, sanctions, all these wars. We need to protect ourselves. It's everyone for himself. And so, of course, what Merkel said was quite likely. I think, the German foreign minister said, well, this is going to push us towards Russia and China. If only not because they want a strategic alliance, but because people need to hedge when they see all of the elements. And one of the factors that has been so powerful in this is the way in which America's used treasury wars have actually dissolved the economic laws. No longer do you know whether it's legal to do business with Iran. Sometimes you think it is, sometimes it isn't. The Treasury leaves everything in a degree of ambiguity, so contracts don't mean anything. The structure of the global system, the consensus is broken, the Plaza Accord is over, we are going to see volatility. Economic volatility is a consequence, I believe, and that economic volatility related to political volatility in the US.
Dmitri, it seems that certainly in Europe, things have gone fairly well for Mr. Putin. As a result of the weakening relationship with the United States, also as the result of changing attitudes in part of Eastern Europe, how do you see, what is Russia's end game in Europe? The West, at least, whether it's true or not, believes that they interfered or tried to interfere in the French elections, as they are said to have interfered in the American elections. How do you see Russia's end game? What does Russia want to achieve in Europe?
Well, frankly, I don't think there's a strategy in Moscow with regard to Europe. I don't think that they could seriously answer your question, honestly. I think if you press them hard, they would say, you know, our ideal Europe, in our view, would be a Europe that would be Russophile in its major capitals, such as Berlin and Paris. A Europe that would take a certain distance to the United States, and a Europe that would hold its Central and Eastern European Russophobes in check. That would be more or less an honest answer. Would that lead to any serious strategy? Probably not, because this is not realistic. It's honest, but it's not realistic. So I think that, by the way, the Russians have totally misread Europe. I think they have better expertise and better results, actually, in the Middle East than they do in Europe. They have totally unlearned, in my view, Mr. Putin personally, have totally unlearned what they probably knew a couple of decades ago about countries such as Germany, such as France, such as Britain, such as many others. but nowhere were they more off the mark than with regard to the country that they should have known so much better, i.e. Ukraine. They totally misread Ukraine. And now you have, as a Russian, you have to consider living next to a country that would be more adversarial to you than maybe any other country in the world. And it's still fairly big, Ukraine, with its 40 million people, populated by people who are, you know, the same kind as the people in Russia. And it's sometimes people would call it a strategic catastrophe. But having said that there's no strategy, I wouldn't say that there's no tactic. There's a tactic now. And having lost any hope in a change for the better in Kiev, Ukraine, and having lost any hope of reaching some kind of an overarching grand bargain with President Trump in Washington, Mr. Putin, I think, is focusing very much on Europe. His suggestion of a UN peacekeeping force, an armed UN peacekeeping force in Donbass, I think is a step in that direction. Because Mr. Putin, I think, clearly understands that continuing bloodshed in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, can serve a series of interests. Some of them in the region, some of them in Kiev, but none of them in Moscow. Moscow loses with every shot. Moscow loses with every drop of blood out there. And I think he is trying to make sure at least that there is a stable ceasefire. However, this is unlikely to be the solution because to Kiev, it's not so much about the ceasefire as the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and control over the border. So it's going to be interesting. He focuses on the Europeans, and I think that even if he fails in his attempt to securely freeze the situation along the line of contact in eastern Ukraine, he will have sent a message, and that message would have received by the Europeans that he meant well. That he wants, I think, at minimum, to start changing the climate in Russia's relations with Europe. And finally, I would say that if I look ahead, and I'm thinking about the objective, to which a serious, realistic strategy would lead, I think the objective in Russian-European relations would be achieving coexistence built on mutual respect for diversity. It's a far cry from recent calls for integration. We're done with that. But coexistence built on respect for diversity could be the next station, which is still far away in Russian-European relations.
Isn't that what he's understood as a multipolar world, in a sense of based on sovereignty and cultural difference?
Well,
which he's outlined.
It certainly fits into that concept, absolutely. He sees Russia today as separate from Europe, separate from China and Asia, separate from many others, and that's it, yes, absolutely.
Just, and I want to move to the Middle East. Former ambassador to Saudi, we have seen that actually the US decline in the region began with the invasion and the post-war after Iraq, which led to a rising power of Iran in that region. Now we have the problems internally with the Kurdish region, the hesitance of Obama in Syria, and the assertion of Russia and Syria made Russia the dominant player in Syria. Now we see that the King of Saudi Arabia, the strongest ally of the United States, with a delegation of 1,000, went to Moscow and did two things. One, reaffirmed what never had been reached before, an agreement on oil production, on oil cuts, We tried that when I was in Oman in '85, and it has been done ever since. It's the first time in the history that actually, for Soviet Union and Russia, that Russia cut production in cooperation with OPEC. And then on top of it, he buys S-400 missiles, which is incredible given what we assume to be the relationship that Saudi has with the United States. Are the Saudis beginning to hedge as a result of what they see developing in the region?
They've been hedging for some time. The recent developments are the product of several factors. First, there's been a long-standing recognition in Saudi Arabia that sole dependence on oil for state revenues is not a long-term strategy that can work. One of two things will happen. Either the demand for oil will diminish, or the reserves will in time be depleted. And in either case, the kingdom has to make a transition to a knowledge economy and high tech. Second, the United States is no longer seen as a reliable and predictable partner. That means that Saudi Arabia must either find new backers or strike out on its own, and it's doing both. The final factor, I suppose, is that Saudi Arabia has been a consumer of defense goods and services. It now aspires to become a producer, a long-term project. And therefore, technology transfer is key to defense sales in Saudi Arabia. The S-400 system, for example, although it's not a completed deal, one of the main issues is how much of it will be made in kingdom. This is a relatively new issue. But overall, we've seen a pattern in which the Saudis have reached out to the Chinese, to the Indians, to the Russians now that Syria has been removed as an active zone of contention between them. And I don't find this surprising at all. I want to say at the end, I was actually going to comment on Europe very briefly, if I might, because, and I think this is related to confusion over terminology. The word ally is bandied about to such an extent that it means nothing. Allies, in my concept, are those who have mutual obligations. Perhaps the US and Britain have been allies in that sense for a century. In most cases, what we're talking about, American allies, have been protectorates with no obligations to the United States at all, or none that they can fulfill. And the United States, in a sense, is trying to rid itself of protectorates and gain allies. And Japan may make that transition. The problem with Europe is the same one that Henry Kissinger first noted. If I want to talk to Europe, who do I call? Europe is not full, Macron notwithstanding, of very innovative strategic thinkers or risk takers. And I think, in fact, we're all missing a bet when we look at Ukraine and Russia. And I want to take you back just a moment in history. After the Napoleonic Wars, the victors had the good sense to reintegrate revolutionary France into the system as a manager of governance in the European space. After World War I, we excluded Germany, a great power, from that role, and we acquiesced in Russia's revolutionary self-seclusion, which didn't work out very well in terms of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and so forth. The task for statesmen after the end of the Cold War was, as Dmitri put it, to find a way to integrate Russia in a position of respect in European affairs, not to Russify Western Europe, not to Western Europeify, if there is such a word, Russia, but to find a relationship in which Russia was part of any solution that could be reached in the European space and not automatically part of the problem. Ukraine should be both a bridge and a buffer between Europe and Russia, and if you stand back, you see that. But we don't stand back. We focus on every little tactical shift, and our emotions have got the better of our reason. And Mr. Trump, to his credit, I think, saw some of this. He has successfully been blocked from pursuing rapprochement with Moscow as a result of the hysteria over Russian active measures during our elections.
You had a quick comment?
Yes, I was just going to say, Jaz, I think perhaps America has been acquiring some of the problems of the Europeans because, as seen from the outside and from Europe, the sense of American government as a sort of vaguely centralized operational unit is no longer there. So people in Europe also ask the question, if I want to ring America, who do I speak to if I want an operational result?
Right.
Is it the president, or do I go to Congress, or to the CIA? Who does one speak to who can actually make a policy effective in the US? So in a sense, it's very similar now, I think.
That is a very good point, because the policy process in Washington is not integrated effectively at present. It's quite chaotic. And this goes back to the question of what allies, in quotation marks, expect of the United States. They expect predictability and reliability, and they're being offered unpredictability and unreliability, and this naturally leads to a deterioration in alliance relationships. The only good part of it is, as I said, it is forcing former American protectorates to think about how to act in their own interest, and that may yet redeem the Russian situation. But we're a long way from there.
A last question before we have to end it is really related to oil. I started out saying that the market has not priced in any geopolitical issues for some time now. I want to ask the panel, given the uncertainty, for example, with Iran, that the president not rolling over the 90 days agreement and in fact throwing it to Congress to decide, and they may decide on new sanctions, which then will escalate into further difficulties and perhaps again continue the problems of the banks financing oil and gas developments in Iran. We have a lot of other regional issues at stake. What are the chances, do you think, of the potential of any serious trouble that could lead to turmoil in the oil market?
I think it's a very important point that you make, because actually one of the things that's most striking is a complete disparity of view between the United States and Europe and outside. In that if you look at the United States at the moment, there is what people in the markets call sort of bull complacency. The volatility index, VIX, has never been lower at about 9.15. There is no movement, everything is calm, everything is absolutely quiet in the sense. And so there's no sense of any anxiety or worry in the United States, in the markets of any sort. It just goes on with this. Partly, I think it's a reflection also of the machines, the robots on the markets that buy in this way, the high-frequency traders and others that are creating this, but it's also the central banks. But then, when you look from the outside, it's the opposite. I mean, I think, and Dmitri can correct me, but I think when you look at it from somewhere like Russia, you see this polarization in America that is very close to violence in many places, which is becoming worse as it goes on, the hatreds between, if you like, the different elements in it. And they can see that this political volatility will have ramifications for economic policy. Is America now capable of producing a financial and monetary policy, a tax bill, or even a debt ceiling of the thing? So they see high volatility on the outside, but in Wall Street and the markets sail along with almost zero volatility in terms of markets. They just continue on with no sense of any need to change their position.
Do you see any trouble, Chas, in the Middle East that could lead to instability in the market over the near future?
I think actually the Middle East is beginning to settle down into a new pattern. The question would be instability, if it happens, is more likely to happen between Israel and Lebanon and Syria than it is anywhere else, and that is not directly involved with oil markets. So to the extent you're limiting yourself to the question of oil trade, pricing, I don't see anything imminent, no. I do think that politics has become very reliably an exercise in misdiagnosing problems, misaddressing them, exacerbating them, and creating new problems where there were none. It is the politics, not the economics, that are driving the instability that we all fear.
I have a final question for you, Dmitri. We have both China and Russia want to cut down the US a little bit in size in terms of its overall power. But it's an interesting relationship because China has a GDP equal to that of the United States, maybe even higher in PPP. Whereas Russia has a GDP about the size of Spain. In that alliance, is that, you know, like Bismarck used to say, in any alliance there is a horse and a rider, and Russia will always be the rider. In this alliance, is China the rider or the horse?
Well, it's neither, in my view, because there's no alliance. What we have is, and I don't think there will be an alliance, what we have is a very interesting relationship that I would characterize as follows. China and Russia will never be against each other, never being. But they will not always be with each other, meaning that those two powers will be able to manage their differences where those differences exist. Neither has to follow the other. I think that the Chinese realize full well that it would be very counterproductive for them to try to be the leader in that relationship. I think that they would recall that when China was very weak in the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was very strong in the 1950s and was giving a lot of support, a lot of aid, a lot of protection to China at that time. Chinese leaders always told the Soviets that they had to be treated as a great power, and a failure to do that would lead to the rupture in the relationship. Stalin was the closest you can get to God in the Marxist, Leninist pantheon, so Mao deferred to him. But when Khrushchev came to power and tried to lead China as a brotherly communist nation, he was told in no uncertain terms by Mao Zedong that that's not the way China would be prepared to act. I think that the Chinese realize that with the Russians. Russia will be a very awkward junior partner for China. So the relationship will be interesting, difficult sometimes, but I think that both countries will, at least for the foreseeable future, as long as Xi and Putin are in power, and it's likely that they will be in power for some time, for quite a while maybe, the relationship will be on an even keel. Although the two countries have very different national might and GDP and all these other things.
Half a minute, Chess.
In 1995, after I left government service, I asked the senior Chinese how they planned to deal with Russia. And the answer was interesting. They said, Russia is down. It's got a little farther to fall, but it will come back. And our objective when it comes back is that it be our partner, not our enemy. And they succeeded. Mm-hmm. Give them credit.
Well, there's a lot more to discuss, but unfortunately our time is up. Please join me in thanking the members of the panel very much for their contributions.